Hi, friends. This is John, and this is the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast. Today, I'm very happy to have with me Jason Mauck from Indiana. Jason is a corn, soybean, wheat, and a hog farmer from Indiana who seems to be pretty much incapable of restricting his thinking to the borders that people collectively would like to impose. Jason is really passionate about relay cropping and having a second crop growing while the first crop does not get harvested. And he talks quite a bit about some seldom heard ideas, such as the value of capturing solar energy by harnessing the phi angle of plant expression. Jason shares a lot of his thoughts and ideas on Twitter and on his YouTube channel, and I would very much encourage you to check those out. Some very valuable thoughts and ideas there for you to contemplate and think about. Jason, I'm very excited to have you here. The journey and the pathway to getting to where we are is always interesting, and I think it's valuable to understand the context. What are you doing today that is different from the mainstream, and what brought you to that point?
Well, I guess it's some people call it chaos, and I think of it more as kind of managing the finites or kind of managing the weather and Mother Nature somewhat. So I've started growing these multiple crops and cover crops through basically getting punched in the face. I came back to farming from losing my father, and first crop I put out was 2011, and I don't know how many crop years that is, but all but two have been extremely wet, so a lot of replanting and things like that, and through kind of trial and error, I've maybe felt like I feel a little bit more in control. I guess that's my main motive, is trying to keep more of a ball in hand approach.
Jason, tell us a little bit about what you're doing. You're excited about relay cropping. What is relay cropping, and how is it working for you?
So relay cropping, the definition in the dictionary, if you will, is basically growing two crops at once. But in relay cropping, the timing is different. So the simplest and easiest thing to do is some type of cool grass cereal, whether it's wheat or rye or barley, with the summer annual. So we have a market for wheat, and it kind of got spurred on from I was selling a little regional company called Broadbeck, and they were coming out with a list soybeans, which was a 2,4-D resistant soybean. So I thought it'd be pretty easy to handle the weed control with the wheat and soybean, so I started down there. And also we have quite a bit of manure, about 5 million gallons a year, so we have tons of nitrogen, high phosphorus levels. I thought it was a way to kind of milk that nutrients out of the soil. But yeah, we're just growing two crops at once, and at first I thought we could just do everything we do with A, so A would be wheat, and everything we do with B, and we would get twice the product, right? Simple as that. Well, figured out that's really impossible. There's only so much water. There's only so much sunlight. There's only so much, not so much nutrients, but it kind of took probably really 4 years to kind of figure out kind of this equilibrium and how to maybe maximize economics and maybe be okay if it was rather dry or rather wet, kind of find a happy medium.
So when did you first begin testing and experimenting with relay cropping?
So that would have been the first year was 12 or 13, and I picked a wet field. It was just a kind of a throwaway field, and it was too wet. We didn't get planted. But the first legitimate year was 2015, and that year I had 30-inch twin row wheat, and I threw a cover crop out there of radishes, a fall manure application. And it worked pretty well, but my wheat was actually too good. The wheat made about 110 bushels per acre, and what I figured out was if you excite the wheat in 30-inch rows, they'll grow laterally and capture all the light. So I basically spent money on soybean seed, and there wasn't enough moisture or light for it to grow, so it was kind of a waste of time. We planted it later on. So the next year we went 7 inches wider, a little bit better. We had really good beans in our lower soil, where we had a little bit more water, and I got to thinking with the schematics and everything, it'd be easier in 60-inch rows. So I went to 60s, and I've been there for about 3 years. So this would be coming up my 5th year, and honestly, I've changed it dramatically every year, still planning on changing it somewhat.
You're growing wheat on 60-inch rows?
Yes. So a little bit different thought process. Instead of a single row or double row, what I've figured out through just multiple experiments within experiments is to empower solar angles. We need wider rows, but the rows themselves need to be wider. So it's a 60-inch row, but the row in itself is anywhere between 17 and 23 inches wide.
Are you planting 17 to 23 inches wide, or you're just allowing the tops of the plants to
We're
broaden
actually
that much?
planting it that wide. So we've tried 3 different ways to do this 60-inch at rows squared, if you will. We've blocked off the drill where we planted 4 consecutive 7.5-inch rows. So that gave us 22.5 and 37.5. I've injected hog manure and put a Gandy box above the manure injection to excite the wheat right above the manure. And that gave me about a 20-inch wide row. And I've developed a strip seeder that is a hybrid between an air seeder, so I get a fantastic stand on the outside, and then kind of fill in the row with biochar that coats the seed and fertilizer below the row. So those 3 different ways. But the idea with the Fat 60 is you need a big enough gap that the crop is going to recognize that space. The lower leaves will grow laterally and collect and bring more energy back to that row. And since it's a relay crop, then the wheat is going to be way ahead of your summer annual. So it can kind of steal the show of sunlight from, March all the way really into maybe the 5th or 10th of June, is collecting all that light. So you can increase per plant production, band your nitrogen, and as we'll get into later, the plant will conform to phi when it's given enough space. So it'll grow taller in the center through competition, and the sides will grow laterally, making kind of this half circle crop architecture.
So when you have this 20-some inch wide row on 60-inch centers,
mm-hmm.
do the heads of the mature wheat end up touching in the center? How close do they come to completely bridging that gap?
Well, it's pretty interesting. There's a time when it maxes vegetation out, depends on the year, but it's sometime in the latter part of May where I can actually I can take the vegetation on one row and stretch it to the other one it touches. And it almost touches without me touching it. So as it gets closer to flower, it actually raises up a little bit. But the tillers that you create by giving the wheat a little bit more space, they'll all find, nature finds a way to survive. So those tillers will naturally jet out the side of the row. So it just conforms even from the beginning all the way to the end into this kind of round circular pattern. But why that's important is, the center of that 60 is your tallest point, to the tune of maybe a foot taller than the side tillers.
Oh, wow.
When you make these 2 circular patterns, it doesn't block the solar angles to the intercrop, and you actually kind of make this dissecting X, if you will. One side of the intercrop will driven on the other side, and the intercrop really doesn't feel the lack of sunshine, if you will, but it takes space for you to be able to make this happen.
So I've never heard anyone else speak about phi angles and the golden mean, the golden ratio, sometimes discussed when talking about tree structure and tree development, but never in broadacre crops. So what you're describing, if I'm understanding it correctly, is that you have this curve aspect happening across the top of each row, where you have a flatter curve on the south-facing side and a steeper curve on the north side that allows the between-row crop more exposure to sunlight. Is that what you're describing?
Exactly. And why phi is relative is it does show up in the crop shape, but it also, phi, the math is 1 plus 1 equals 2, 2 plus 1 equals 3, 3 plus 2 equals 5. So as you get deeper into the sequence, each revolution is of greater value. So if you can allow each crop to genetically express, then you allow that math to play out longer. So that's how you can get a corn plant to put on 6 or 10 ears, how you can get a wheat plant to put on 6 or 10 or even 20, or I've had plants with, if you let a volunteer wheat plant grow throughout the year, you can have 200 wheat heads from a single seed. It allows that math to play out longer. And that's where you get all the economics, especially when we're paying so much for each seed. So we can kind of exploit the big ag mentality of plugging all these technologies into a seed. Still get those technologies. There's no gun to your head that says, John, you must plant 37,000 corn seeds. You can plant 4. You can plant 1/6 of the wheat seed. You can still get the same thing. You just get more value per seed and more value per day and more value kind of managing your finite.
This reminds me a bit of what was originally described or called the system of root intensification that was developed by Dr. Norman Uphoff at Cornell University. And I think today is called the system of root intensification, where it's kind of essentially the same idea. You give plants more space, allow the root system to develop into a larger root system, and you can support a much larger plant and have a much smaller plant population, but in fact achieve the same or higher yields. As you've been taking this approach, what have the economic responses been? What have the yield results look like? If you're only planting 20% or 25% of the seed, what does the crop yield look like?
Well, that's where I lose people, because it's, if you want to maximize wheat yield, I would plant it a little bit later, and I wouldn't want tillers. I'd plant more seed. I'd give it plenty of shots of nitrogen, all this fungicide and all this stuff. So I can't make any money doing that. So to me, the value of wheat is basically time and space. So the value is that it consumes water. It is photosynthesizing and feeding my biology, and it consumes water at the rate of about 1 acre inch per 3 bushels that I extract. So my mentality is not about maximizing the yield of the first one. It's about contribution margin. So I figured out different ways to really cheapen the wheat up. So that was why my big motive here at the beginning was, look, I know how to make better wheat, but how can I make it as cheap as possible? And I think I can actually have a net negative cost so it's all context, but I've had all these hogs for over 20 years, so our soil fertility is pretty high. But I have to pay for custom dragline application. So instead of paying a penny a gallon, about $50 an acre on this phosphorus and nitrogen I really don't need that much of, I just took off every other shank of my manure tanker and drove as fast as possible. And then I only planted 1/8 of the wheat seed, and the wheat only grew off the hog manure that was locally placed. So I could do that myself for about $10 a wheat seed and about $15 in cost. So that would be like a net negative cost of $25. So that makes, even though the wheat makes 35, 40 bushels, it's a lot of contribution margin considering this. And this is the biggest calculation. The more that I compromise through time and space, or wider rows, and not consuming too much of my finites, aka water, aka time, I can actually increase the yield of the second crop. So we achieved record yields with our soybeans by using the wheat as pattern tile, if you will, and also using the wheat's corpse to reflect the light. So when I harvest the wheat and I push that straw down, I can reflect the sun off of the soil surface, but also drive light lower in that soybean canopy, allowing that plant to receive 3 or 4 times the sun capture at a key time in R2 and R3 when it's making, all of its grain yield. So it's kind of this play that looks at the whole season and kind of manages sun capture and water, extracting water when it's a liability and not an asset, which is different where you live. Where I'm at, I get 40 inches of rain, so I'm not trying to preserve every drip drop. I'm trying to consume something.
So we're using the language of relay cropping, but what you're describing, in essence, you're thinking of using the wheat almost as a nurse crop for the beans, the way it sounds.
Exactly.
So when you're thinking about the bean as being your high value crop and increasing yields for those, how have your plant populations changed in the beans? We talked a little bit about the wheat, but how are you managing the beans differently from the way they were in the past?
So we try to keep the same row population, and we've been around 100 and started about 180 really when I started farming. We dropped that down as low as 112, 115. The only caveat to this, I'm usually really pushing my soybean planting as early as possible. I've been planting in March to try to get earlier flower. So we're keeping it around 120 to 130,000 plants, but I think I can drop that back a little bit.
You're planting soybeans in March in Indiana?
Yes, yes.
Your wheat must be doing a great job of taking moisture out of the soil.
Exactly. It is taking moisture out, and it's kind of like geothermal heating, if you will. So you kind of make this microclimate, and I'll kind of entertain you. I call it maybe it's not entertaining, but I call it an agronomic algorithm. So you've got your wheat, right? It's going to wake up as soon as our sun angle gets stronger, even in late February and early March. And as soon as we get these little heat wave, it's actively growing. So when we place that soybean an inch in the ground in late March, it's going to take so much heat, GDUs, sun heat, to let that soybean actually emerge. It's usually going to take 3 or 4 weeks. The wheat's doing a job of giving that seed a little bit more oxygen. When we get rain, we get a little bit better infiltration right there. But also in that heat, enough heat to make that soybean arise, the wheat's growing that whole time. So the wheat will go from, say, 5 inches tall to 15 inches tall in that time, and it will grow horizontally. So when the soybean emerges, it's in a position where it's kind of underneath this California wave, if you will. So the tillers are going over the top, and let's say that it gets, say, 28 degrees, which is your 2-meter temperature. Your soil is going to hold some thermal equity, but it's going to be slightly warmer right up against that wheat. So there's really not much fear of killing that soybean due to frost from putting it in that position. So that allows us to get a little bit more aggressive. And the reason that's really relevant, it's really important to get to bloom as quick as possible. If I can get that thing to bloom, say, June 5th, and so instead of around summer solstice, since it's a short-day crop, the earlier I bloom, the later it's going to trigger senescence through a short day. So each one of those dates there's been research that I can get 2 or 3 bushels per day. Now, it's not a pure day because, let's say, I'll get into weeds here, but if it flowers June 6th instead of June 21st, it's not going to give you however many days that is, 15. It'll probably give you an extra 6 or 8, but it's still going to give you longer time in reproduction.
So that's really where you're gaining additional yield and additional bushels per acre is partially coming from the earlier planting and having more days for reproductive bud set and pollination.
Exactly. And also, I've done spectrum analysis plots. So we've done 17 different varieties, and the later I push the maturity of the soybeans, the more yield I get. And I think I can use maturities that are well beyond where I need to be with my latitude, because when I prune the wheat and I empower that soybean with 3 or 4 times more light per plant, the soybean feels that it's getting a longer day or just strictly more sunlight capture. It changes its vegetative motive as well. That prune and more light, it stops having that vegetative motive where it's in competition with the same species. So it kind of shortens the plants themselves, shortens the space in between the nodes. And I think that going back to that phi math or compound interest, it increases or lowers the time in between node set. So maybe I'm creating a node every 2.5 days instead of every 4 days, something like that, because I'm getting 4 to 6 more nodes in a relay setting such as this.
Jason,
and I've seen that 2 years in a row, seeing the relay versus mono.
Jason, let's go back for a moment. I interrupted you earlier when you were speaking about your soybean spacing. How are you spacing your plants between the 60-inch centered wheat?
So to make it simple, just imagine 60-inch rows on center. Your wheat is 20 inches wide, which leaves a 40-inch gap. Your soybeans are planted in 20, 40-inch rows, but the 20s are between the 40-inch gap. So that gives you about a 10-inch spacing between the edge of the wheat and the soybean row. So that 10 inches goes away quickly when the wheat grows because it's going to grow horizontally. So that's about as close as I can get it to the wheat and not have it completely smother it. And then also that 20 inches or that 40-inch gap straddling the 20s gives me plenty of room to grow a huge soybean, R2. When I harvest the wheat, I push the soybeans down, and even though it's a big bean with branches, I have enough space for my combine traffic to go in between those soybean rows.
You spoke about your fertility applications on the wheat with your manure application at planting. Are the beans also benefiting from that? Are you putting on any additional fertility applications for the beans? It's
kind of a trick play with the manure. So you've got some nitrogen there, especially as the soil temperature starts to warm up as we get into summer. You're going to release a lot of that organic nitrogen. So in a monocrop setting, it probably would spur on too much vegetative growth and allow them to lodge. But since they're pruned, you can kind of let that nitrogen heat up and release and manage that vegetative motive through that spacing. And any plant by itself, whether it's a tree or a corn plant or anything, it's going to grow shorter and wider with space. So it's kind of a way to offset that and kind of a way to make the most of wider row spacings.
There's a number of other topics that I want to get to as well, but the one question that comes to mind right now, we've been talking about so far about wheat and soybeans. I'm curious, are you doing anything after the beans? Is there a relay that then comes in while the beans are still in the field? Is this a continuous relay, or you're just looking at this as the wheat and the beans as a one-off?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the one-off for now. The corn really does well afterwards, but we normally get quite a bit of volunteer wheat. It's mostly our harvesting hasn't been quite optimized yet. We're using pans to push down the soybeans, and we're getting a little bit of harvest loss on the heads. So quite a bit of volunteer wheat will spur on, and we're usually striping the wheat like we're mowing grass when we harvest the soybeans. So you can call it what you want. You can call it harvest loss or a cover crop, but there is a cereal with roots actively growing there.
You're effectively doing relay with the wheat and the beans. Are you doing something similar with corn? Are there any other crops that you've experimented with at this point?
Yeah, with corn and soybeans, it's not quite relay because they kind of share the same season. Now, we tried to relay it, and that might be an answer of growing ultra early corn and harvesting the corn separate, and then having the soybeans green and buy another 5 or 6 weeks on the back half. And that also helps when you're shooting out residue out of the back of the combine. You're not beating the pods and having harvest loss. But I think the true value in the corn soybeans thing is completely milking the curve. So going back to that phi curve, what's pretty interesting, there was about 3 years ago, I took a corn plant and grew it by itself, and I produced 31 silks. Now, I ran out of daddy sauce, if you will, and I couldn't pollinate them all. But there's about 22 ears with quite a bit of grain on it. And what we can do with the corn and soybeans is, I'll give credit to the guy that kind of gave me this idea. A man by the name of James Bates was a plant breeder in Hawaii, and he was seeing a kind of a wilting. He was seeing as the day went on, there was quite a bit of heat stress in soybean plants in Hawaii. So he started shading the soybean plants with different obstructions and seeing as the sun changed position through the day and cast shadows, it would give it kind of a break, if you will, from direct sunlight. So what we're doing is planting corn in 60-inch rows and then putting a diamond patterned stair-step gaps in the corn and lowering the population. I did several different studies, anywhere from 11, 2 in solid rows all the way down to 3,000 or 4,000. And as you lower the corn population, you trigger 3 or 4 or 5 ears per plant. And then your soybeans, as you get less aggressive on the corn, will shorten and add more nodes. And I think there's a spot there somewhere around 4,000 where we actually may start increasing soybean yields. Then we completely milk the corn curve with corn. So yeah, you're not getting 240 bushel corn. You might be getting 80, but if you can get 80 bushels of 4,000 seeds and only locally placed nitrogen or just locally squirted starter or astronaut food, if you will, around the corn seed that's biochar or humic that's inoculated with ammonium or some energy source that just gives a competitive advantage to allow it to capture sun, then you can grow corn for literally $15, $20. So it doesn't take much to add contribution margin. It's just a matter of figuring out the logistics of separating it and all that stuff, which we're working on.
Yeah, if you're actually increasing soybean yields, then you could even attribute the fertility costs to the beans and say that your 80 bushel corn crop is free.
Yeah.
Wow. So when you look at the wheat and bean relay or the corn and bean relay, what do the net economics look like in a cropping season versus doing individual crops?
Well, that's why I'm in this Acela farm, because it can continue to get better and better and better, in my opinion. And it's all down to reduction. One thing I talk about when I speak on the stage is that, we're continuously getting better with yield, but we're continuously writing bigger checks. So I think significance is through reduction or eliminating or automating nature or delegating jobs to nature. One thing that's interesting with the wheat relay is, do we need to spray herbicide in the space that the wheat resides? So one thing when we push tiller density in that space is we temper the straw to not lodge, but we also can't allow, sunlight can't penetrate that canopy. So there's no reason to spray herbicide in that space. So can we take 45, 50% of our herbicide off the ledger there? And then when we talk contribution margin, if we can raise that wheat for whatever system we're in. What I'm getting into now is where we dry down and burn manure down to the biochar. We got this effluent, and I think we can raise wheat for somewhere around $60 to $80 in variable cost. So if we can achieve 40 or 50 bushel wheat and lower herbicide only in that space and achieve $150 contribution margin, that contribution margin is just like raising, 17 or 20 bushel more soybeans. But if we can lower our seeding rate with the soybeans, lower our cost of production down, and maybe increase yield, or if nothing else, not crap the bed on a wet year, add some resiliency there, that's where they really start adding up, is lowering cost, increasing yield of the soybeans, and then getting contribution margin. It's kind of a three-way deal there. It depends on the context, but I'm very comfortable saying it's at least a $200 advantage with the wheat soybeans, if not $300 or $400, depending on kind of how good we get at optimizing it.
Wow, you can't afford to grow monocrops anymore.
Right.
You simply can't afford to grow monocrops anymore at that rate. And of course, the economics are they're a significant piece of this picture, but I don't think we should discount the climate resiliency. The piece that you were speaking about with having the capacity to plant soybeans early and actually protect them from frost and remove excessive early moisture, that is also adding significant climate resiliency. And
exactly.
In the world we live in today, that becomes a very important piece.
And I know we talk about, the cereal consuming water, but you get into Pennsylvania, or we even have hills. If you're on a 10-degree slope and it rains 2 inches in an hour and you have nothing out there, where's that water going? It's going right down the hill, after a quarter inch or a half inch. We can just physically stop it in its place and infiltrate it in place. The wheat might not be as heavy in those lighter soil types, but we may actually be in a better position come August because we physically stop the water in its place, and then stop the heat on the soil from that thatch. We may be able to actually increase yields through actually increasing water that physically was absorbed in certain spots of the field. So it doesn't just help your wet areas, I think it helps your droughty areas possibly as well, with compromise by not pushing yield.
Right. Sounds like a win-win.
Yeah, sounds cheesy, but it's cool. It's cool to see. I've got so much footage of a drone where I have the relay and the monocrops. And the monocrops, it's just so much more spotty throughout the fields. You get the yellow spots where you have too much rain, and the relay it's actually easier to grow a more even crop. It's pretty neat once you start kind of pulling the strings somewhat.
What other benefits have you noticed of the relay cropping? We've been talking about climate resiliency and economics. Just now you mentioned crops grow more evenly. Have you observed any other advantages, any other agronomic advantages to the relay cropping?
Well, I think you just get better plant health, which is partly of the infiltration. But think about that. When you get that big 2 or 3 or 4 inch rain before you're getting any uptake, and you're basically trying to raise a baby in Baghdad, you've got bombs going everywhere, you're going to lose some stuff in the low spots or whatever, you can keep all your root hairs, right? That's what really kills you, is those stressful events early in a crop's lifespan. If you lose those root hairs and you lose the root mass, then you've shot the top end right off the table. And that pays so much more dividends later on. But also, I look at plant architecture as a whole life cycle thing. I talk about the pruning and maximizing that during reproduction, but also I kind of tucking that plant in next to the wheat, but also have this ambient light to its side to encourage branching on the opposite side of the plant. And because I can get to vegetative stages earlier in the season, and I don't have as many growing degree units as I'm going through vegetative stages in, say, May instead of June, I don't stretch out. So I can encourage branching lower in the soybean plant, and I can get 3, 4, 5 branches with significant node counts on those branches. So it just goes back to that compound interest. Building more branches and more nodes allows me to exponentially increase my reproductive sites on the plant.
You mentioned the impact of pruning, and I can imagine, we know the impact that topping has on the soybeans. What stage are the beans at when you are harvesting the wheat, and how does the wheat harvest impact the soybean plant and its future yield potential?
Yeah, so the soybean plant we're not harming whatsoever. We worked with a company called FlexiFinger and made this pad that we snap onto the head, and it just makes the soybean do the limbo. So it just kind of pushes it over. You can have a 2-foot soybean that pushes down to 6 inches. It takes about an hour, and it pops right back up. So you're taking that wheat thatch now. So the wheat has a ground floor of 20 inches, but it kind of is pushing up against the soybean plant. And as it dies, the grain starts drying, then it loses kind of its force. So just imagine, John, that you're arm wrestling a dude that ages rapidly. Okay, you're arm wrestling him at first. He's 20 years old. And you're like, oh, crap, this guy's going to beat me. And then by the time he's 80 years old, you just break his knuckles on the table because he has no vigor anymore. So as that soybean plant goes through the juvenile stage and has this rapid growth, it will push up against that wheat. And no weeds can penetrate that. But as you now take the biomass of the wheat, it's kind of like Thanksgiving afternoon, you unbuttoning your pants and letting your gut kind of pop out. Those beans will kind of allow them to really kind of expand. It only takes about 10 or 14, maybe 20 days for that bean to zip back shut. If the bigger soybeans, maybe even earlier than that. That's enough time for the light to drive lower in that soybean plant, reflect off that thatch, and it just, the plant will completely change its growth habit. I don't know if you ever noticed this, but if you go by the inrows of corn, whether it's east, west, or north, south, the leaves will actually conform just kind of like a sunflower head. And the soybean leaves on the lower part of the plant will grow out quickly and intercept that light.
Interesting. Jason, you get first prize for colorful analogies. I want to have you on a comedian stage sometime. So when you made the comment that as these plants are pushing up against each other, first the wheat is pushing up against the beans and then later on the reverse, that no weed can go through that. Earlier you mentioned that you're still using herbicides, but perhaps cutting the application strips down to half or to 40%. Are you observing a situation where, or have you observed the potential where these crops might be so vigorous that there is not a need to use herbicides at all? Because I'm just thinking about this. If you're planting beans in March and they're emerging and start growing, it would seem to me that they would be an effective competitor to the weeds because they may be out of the ground before the weeds are out of the ground.
Yeah, that's one thing we're thinking about doing. It's just, it's going to be a while before the beans really add vigor. So we developed this zero spacing idea for this year. And it goes back to that air seeder on the outside and then filling in. So if you use 50% of your seed on the outside and then 50%, you're only going to have a interplant spacing and maybe 2 or 3 inches on the soybeans. And that's basically what you're racing up against is, can the soybeans win the race? So can you put a strip till unit in there that does clean tillage in the relative area that where you'll have weed pressure, which is in the center of the row, have a clean slate and then have the beans win? I don't know. It's not going to be perfect. You're going to get a little further, but it could be done. I mean, I think if you really wanted to get away from herbicide, you'd do probably one cultivation pass there, just scratching the surface and probably planting your 2040s, having a cultivator shovel in between the soybean row and then in between the soybean rows and have your wheel traffic in between there. You could probably get by with one cultivation pass with that.
Yeah, I think actually this is an important question for our listeners in understanding the context. You are incorporating your liquid manure by injecting it. Are you doing any other tillage? How does tillage play a role in your operation?
Well, it's changed. So in the past, we've dragline manure after corn harvest, and we're using a chopping corn head. So we have quite a bit of residue. We're draglining it, and then we're using a soil finisher before we plant the wheat. So we're getting level seed bed and a clean tillage pass. This past year, we only used a strip seeder deal. So we've got zero tillage on 51 inches of it, and a strip till, a pass for the wheat row, and then an air seeder that's basically sidecard of the strip till unit, about 5 inches on either side. So it's primarily untouched.
When we think about nutrition management, you talked about your historical applications of manure and having lots of nitrogen and phosphorus. And so far, twice in our conversation, you've mentioned using biochar, which is not something that I commonly hear being used in broadacre production agriculture. How are you using the char? What have you learned with the char so far? Where is it coming from? Tell us a little bit about that.
So the char long-term My company is working on a solution for manure distribution. The short story on that is there's areas of the Corn Belt where there's 3 or 4 or 5 counties wide. There's just millions of animals, and the manure is just too much for the geographic area. So we take the excess manure from growers and we make renewable natural gas. We separate the digestate into potable water that we can discharge back to the animals or irrigate, an effluent that's rich in nitrogen and potassium, humics and micros. And then we burn the solids through a gasification process down to manure biochar, which is different than regular biochar. Your wood biochar is about 70 or 80% carbon, but it's about 1/4 of the weight per volume. So there's more carbon, but not in a 5-gallon bucket. There's going to be more carbon in manure biochar, and also organic phosphorus and a lot of minerals. But anyway, until that's built, we've been sourcing this through a variety of places, but mostly from a turkey manure biochar in southern Indiana. And what we did this year, we did several experiments in the garden with flowers to kind of get a handle on that, but we also planted 10 relay fields with this strip seeder machine, and we took that biochar and ran it through a really small mesh screen and got it down to basically the powder, and we mixed it with the wheat seed and some fertilizer, which was mostly urea and AMS, and just a little bit of potash and MAP, primarily AMS, and it turns it all black as you put it in the mixer. It adheres, especially to the nitrogen, really well. And the idea is, can we place that commercial nitrogen underneath the cereal in the fall and not have it lose through denitrification, leaching, or gassing off in that time period between application and spring green up? So, seeing research online, but until we see it with our eyes, I really won't have a feel for how that works. But that's kind of the idea.
You're just beginning with this. You don't have any field experience with it yet at this point.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it's a really great idea. I know that in our work, we've done some work with biochar amended compost from wood source biochar, of course, with some really intriguing results at relatively small application rates, 25 to 100 pounds per acre. Actually, growers that we've been working with, quite a large group in southeastern Pennsylvania, have found that they don't get increasing benefits from char applications above 100 pounds per acre. And this is in
so
terms
that would
of
be
measuring
5%.
This is they were measuring it in terms of soil response, fungal to bacterial biomass, and bacterial and total microbial populations.
I gotcha.
They didn't get an increased response above 100 pounds per acre. So, yeah, intriguing.
It is intriguing.
Jason, you have a very different perspective on agriculture than many people do. You're willing to think about it differently. What is something that you believe to be true about modern agriculture that is very different from the mainstream view?
Well, I just don't think we're really going to come up with a real world solution to regenerative agriculture until we connect directly with consumers. It's really hard to dump grain in a pit next to a guy doing it a different way and receive any type of value that's not going to be criticized. So I think that's really what I've focused in on my future, is trying to figure out systems and ways, maybe not through just row cropping, to directly sell my product to the community. And I don't think a lot of people are willing to do that. But, eventually we're going to have to. I mean, farmers are getting older and older by the year, and there's a lot of younger guys that want to become part of the operation. And we just can't play the same game that the older generation is playing. We just aren't going to be able to. So that's kind of what direction I'm looking towards.
Yeah, and obviously that is a very big conversation with lots of contributing factors and lots of people talking about social and economic and political factors that all play a role. So that is a very big conversation. But I agree with you that the principle that we need to develop regionalized, decentralized food systems where people actually know where their food is coming from and it's not coming from thousands of miles away. That's the ultimate way that you really ensure integrity and transparency. The best transparency is face-to-face or in reasonable proximity. And also, proximity can be through technology. It's easy today for farmers to be out on their farm, and you do this very well. This is something that I really admire about your work, is you walk out into a field and almost everyone has a smartphone today, and you can record a video of what's happening and what's going on in real time and post it today. It's so easy. And that is one method of providing transparency and proximity. It doesn't have to be in with boots on the ground, although certainly there is a benefit to some of that happening for sure.
Yeah.
Jason, what is one thing that you wish all farmers knew?
Oh, man. I don't know. I feel like a hypocrite here because I'm still a young farmer, so there's a lot of people that have more seasons underneath their belt. But I don't see a lot of farmers actually put the truck in park and walk out and get lost in their field for several hours a week. And I don't know if I will change that, but that's where I learn everything, literally everything. And it's not in field view, it's not in data numbers, it's not telling me what hybrid to plant. It's just in these little just ancillary values that you see not only from observing your crop, but realizing that, okay, you farm 500 acres or 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000, whatever it is, you don't have to risk the farm on a huge amount of acres. You can have this incubator mentality where, okay, let's take 10 acres and do this. Let's take an acre and do 10 different experiments here, and think everything more in a 3 to 5 year deal, and realize that the things that you learn maybe on that 1 acre, 10 different ways, it's going to have crazy amount of value 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road. So I think we're always looking for that silver bullet, that 5 to 10 bushels, and it usually always comes with a pretty big price tag and a bunch of promises, but I think we can learn a lot by learning it organically ourselves.
A comment that I can offer on that is that all of our most successful growers that we work with at AEA do exactly that. They spend a lot of time in their fields and they refuse to delegate it to crop scouts. There's obviously a place and a need for crop scouts in some contexts, but they insist on spending time in the field with boots on the ground. We talked about a number of different topics, cropping and biochar. What resources would you recommend people go to and seek out if they want to learn more? What are some resources that you often recommend to people?
Well, I think it goes back to the previous question. And the previous two, really, when you go out and you are looking at things, and then you get on your phone or you go to a conference and you actually get off the table and you talk to people, the resources are all around you, right? But until you share something through your own experiences, you're not going to open the book to everyone else. So that may be the easy way out here. I know there are resources written all the time, but maybe the most valuable thing is through really close-knit relationships with peers.
In other words, you have to share information and value, and then you can expect it to come back to you 10 times over again.
Exactly.
I certainly find that to be true. I'm having a lot of fun with the blog since I started publishing that in December, and the one really delightful surprise has been that every blog post I publish, I learn more about that topic immediately after from people who send me emails and respond on social media with things that they've observed and learned. And it's an incredible feedback loop because I'm passionate about sharing information, but I'm learning as much or more that I'm sharing, which is really inspiring and a lot of fun.
Yeah. And just think about this. You know, I was on a podcast called Vance Crow about a month ago, and he was talking about, I know I'm going to butcher this, Gutenberg's press, you know, when the books first start coming out. And you had to physically buy the book, you had to be able to read, and you had to be in basically a quiet place so you could read, have the time. But now people like yourself are making podcasts every day with a wealth of knowledge and blog posts with everybody else is in, and I can put earbuds in and go out in my field and do all my dorky agronomist stuff while I'm listening to your information. So people have a tremendous ability to not be in a deep, dark place alone to ingest all this information when you're rebuilding your planter or, you know, doing some mindless farming practice that we're all doing in the spring to get ready for the season. We can be ingesting this. We don't have to spend 100% of our brain waves on simple tasks.
Jason, we've had a fairly focused and rapid-fire conversation. Is there anything important that you would like to add or speak about that we haven't touched on yet?
I think I asked you this before in Wichita, but my big motive in the next 3 or 4 years is develop community garden idea I'm seeing waste everywhere. Just right down the road, we've got a tremendously large operation, a greenhouse, and they supply Southwest Indiana with tomato plants, pepper plants, pumpkins, all these vegetables. And late May comes around. If they don't sell them, they throw them in the dumpster. And what I'd like to do is take 2, 3, 4, 5 acres, whatever it is, in metropolitan outskirts and raise this tremendously robust cover crop and push that down, crimp it down, and make these holes and open up this hole and put this tremendous composted material that's full of biochar and plenty of energy to give that transplant off to a great start. And I want to cut that 2 or 3 or 4 acres into a grid and let hundreds of, middle school, high school kids have their little 20-foot or 30-foot by 30-foot area, and they market those vegetables to their friends and family and social media. And you turn all these little entrepreneurs, you get them the heck out of the house, off their smartphones, quit looking at video games, talk to people, engage, start a business when it really doesn't matter, but also layer regenerative thought process in here and change this idea that gardening or farming has to be this labor-intensive tillage and all this stuff. What do you think? Do you think I've lost my mind that I can gather that many people together?
I love the idea, Jason. I think that we need to bring back the 2020 version of Victory Gardens. And so I love the idea in that context. Are you crazy? Well, I'm reminded of a quote. I forget the original reference. I'll paraphrase it just a bit, but it's basically, day before anything is a breakthrough, it's considered a crazy idea. So all great breakthroughs started, and some people perceive them as being a really crazy idea. And the thing that we can do to really determine whether it's going to be effective or not is to try. Let's try. Let's put the effort into it, and we will discover whether it's successful or not. And if it may not be successful in the way that we originally envisioned it or imagined it, but parts of it and elements of it are likely to be very successful beyond our wildest expectations, and then we can continue to build on those. So I love the idea. I think it's definitely something that you should do. And regarding the labor aspect of it, I grew up on a smaller scale fruit and vegetable farm. My dad started in 1994 when we had, I think, a half an acre of vegetables when we first started. And a few years later, we were up to 15. And we actually worked less with 15 acres of vegetables than we did when we had 1 or 2 because we had the right equipment and the right tools. So I think if you have the scale-appropriate tools and scale-appropriate equipment, particularly in the context of this entire regenerative conversation, it doesn't need to be that labor-intensive. Yes, it's going to take labor. You need to pick fruit, and you're never going to get away from that entirely, nor should you desire to. But because it's important to have that connection and for people to actually be out in the field. But I think you can absolutely minimize the challenging labor that is required that would get people to have a desire to not be out there in the first place.
Just think about how powerful that would be if you could develop this, I'll use it again, agronomic algorithm where you're using nature to make less work. And you invited all these kids out to do a day of work and they were dreading it, and you told them to bring their family members or something like that, and you come out there and there's nothing to be done because the mat is doing work, the compost is making the crops vigorous, and then you can just go around and look at things and basically require nothing, and then they go back and tell their friends.
You're also harnessing a very powerful idea. If you offer young people the opportunity to be entrepreneurial, to take ownership, to make this theirs.
I think that's so much more important than passing a standardized test.
Yeah.
And we didn't get into this. I won't spend most of the time, but the whole chicken tractors things or in-row grazing, I think we can do the same thing as a community garden where we have, whether it's young people or people in the community actually own another entity that does jobs and ancillary benefits for the other crop. And both of them ratchet each other's value up. And the story ratchets the value up.
Well, Jason, this has been a very enjoyable conversation. Thank you very much for being on and for sharing your insights and thoughts. And I look forward to having more conversations with you in the future.
Same here, John. Enjoy every minute of it.
Thanks, Jason.
The team at AEA and I are dedicated to bringing this show to you because we believe that knowledge and information is the foundation of successful regenerative systems. At AEA, we believe that growing better quality food and making more money from your crops is possible. And since 2006, we've worked with leading professional growers to help them do just that. At AEA, we don't guess, we test, we analyze, and we provide recommendations based on scientific data, knowledge, and experience. We've developed products that are uniquely positioned to help growers make more money with regenerative agriculture. If you are a professional grower who believes in testing instead of guessing, someone who believes in a better, more regenerative way to grow, visit advancingecoag.com and contact us to see if AEA is right for you. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to working with you.